So I feel when I use the term Buddhist psychology, it's really in some way like giving credit where it's due. It's coming from this lineage, and we kind of recognize that. The applied component for me, however, becomes very, very critical, because it's one thing to go to a doctor and get medicine, but you get your prescription filled and you keep it by your bedside. You're not really getting better. Dawai liya hai, you need to kind of consume it, right, according to the schedule.
Hi, Nivedita. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Deepak. Happy to be here.
So nice of you to take the time, and I'm quite interested in going through this conversation given your background, and also I'm quite interested in Buddhist psychology and also the applied part of it, which we'll converse. But before we move to that part, Nivedita, could we start with a quick understanding of your background and your journey, which has got you to this point?
Okay, it's a slightly long one. I'll give you the short version of it.
Long would also do, don't worry.
So for me, always there's been a sense of recognizing that what we see somehow is not all of it. And I think as a kid, I would pick up on that, but I don't think I had the vocabulary to articulate it. Bas ek lagta hai ki there must be something more. So anyway, I took up mental health, thinking that will have the secret. So I decided to start studying in psychology initially. But then, of course, I chose a field called occupational therapy. And occupational therapy, I think, was a lovely field because even though it has its roots in a biomedical framework, it actually tries to see the individual very holistically. But then I figured I still don't have enough answers. Then moved into understanding psychology and counseling. And I began getting involved with the development sector with this fabulous organization called Samaritans in Bombay. I was with them for several years. We did a lot of work with suicide prevention, worked with people with mental illnesses. And I think what Samaritans did for me was really it broadened my take on mental health. You start realizing that so much else becomes a part of who you are. So even understanding society, understanding systems, culture, all the rest of it. So then I decided to study Psychiatric Social Work from Tata Institute. Then I did my master's, MPhil, PhD from there. Continued to work in a whole range of organizations, including Thane Mental Hospital, which was, I think, very intense, but very, very helpful to broaden perspective. But each time I feel every step of the way, learning was great, but I wanted to go a little deeper. Fortunately, I came across a group which teaches arts-based therapy in Pune, which is the WCCL Foundation. And they had their roots very strongly in Indian tradition. And I got introduced to Buddhist philosophy. And I feel that in many ways, actually also helped me go much more deeper than what I had imagined. And I think beginning to find some of the answers, or at least forget answers. Cholo, I'm at least asking the right questions, at least I think for now, which is good. So I'm continuing to study. It's been many, many years of studying, but that seems to be a lifelong process. And yeah, here I am. I offer a course in applied Buddhist psychology because I feel if someone like me could be helped so much, there are definitely others who can also benefit.
Move to applied Buddhist psychology. A couple of questions, Nivedita. So something which you mentioned is I think has come up again and again in our interviews, which is something was missing or there was something which didn't feel like as it appears.
Right.
I think you mentioned that you didn't have the vocabulary to articulate in that manner.
Correct.
But in terms of perception, what exactly were you feeling at that time?
So, I remember, as a kid versus now, which one do you mean?
As a kid.
As a kid, how you try to fit in and you try to seem like you've got a grip on things, or you try to do all the right things that you're told, ki padhai kar lo, things will be fine, get the grades, be a good kid. And you try and match and meet all of those needs. You put the checklist. But you still somehow on the inside, there's a sense of, is this all there is? Is this all there is? Which I think was a kind of like a nagging feeling. So you can't put your finger on it. You're doing what you're being told because, you believe in the wisdom of the people around you, the ones who love you, who are guiding you. But you can't help but wondering, is this it? And I feel this question of, is this it, right? All of us have our checklist. Like you want a job, you want the right partner, the right car, and then in some time, now it's of course right phone and the right I don't know, media presence and the right everything. And it's almost like we're chasing this right something because that will fix it. That will fix in some way this restlessness on the inside. And now I recognize that maybe not, and if we want to fix that restlessness or the itch on the inside, maybe we should turn the lens around a little bit. Because for grades may, promotion may, or in anything else, I don't know if that itch goes or gets resolved as much.
Is this a rearticulation of, so initially we were feeling, is this it? And now it's a rearticulation of this is it. Is that how you see it?
I feel shifting the lens inward definitely is it. In the sense that, of course, once you turn the lens inward, it's not like the work is over. The work is actually just begun. But fortunately, at least I feel the direction is perhaps more accurate. Because while, of course, we need to have some level of comfort on the outside, this is not to say that, you can study or practice in any way if you're hungry and you have no safety around you. There is definitely a need for basics. But what becomes the basic, I think, is very debatable. At some point of time, we need to recognize that external achievements, whether it is money, whether it's people around you, whether it's validation, whether it's all of these aspects, it's going to satisfy you up to a point. But beyond that, frankly, is it really the answer? And I feel those are questions we need to start playing around with for ourselves and to find answers also which match who we are and who we want to be, right?
And before you came to Buddhism, you already had these experiences with the suicide prevention
Yes.
work you did and the Tata Mental Hospital. All that stuff was in the past.
Yes.
So those would have been pretty, I wouldn't assume, intense and overwhelming experiences. How were they? I mean, how did you cope with such a drastic change into? I mean, I've never been in that sphere, but just assuming that how normally we live our lives and then find out different fires to put out, and then to be turned to the other perspective where people are really facing drastic mental challenges. How did you articulate that, and how did you cope with that before coming to Buddhism?
So frankly, I've also been very, very fortunate. Even at Samaritans, for example, the director in charge was Frenny, and Frenny I thought was a splendid, not just a teacher, but the way she kind of held the space. A lot of my root practices of counseling came from really being around her and in some ways being under her tutoring, even though it wasn't formal education. And I feel if you are able to kind of find mentors or teachers who can guide you, and similarly groups. So, we had a fairly large group of volunteers who would come in for suicide prevention. And there were structures in place in terms of how one handles a call, how one debriefs after a call, how one supports each other during that process. And I feel it's never any one thing which works. Usually it's a combination of things. And there are some days I feel you lean more on one person. On other days, you lean more on the other systems which are there, and all of which is okay. So the goal is to really say, can there also be collective spaces which encourage us to, in some way, be the best version of you in terms of helping people out and being there for people? And then the system kind of helps you regenerate and recharge and find your steps again. And having said that, it's also it gets you to question what is normal. And I feel that's a privilege many of us don't have. You're just told this is not normal or this is normal, right? Or this is right and this is wrong. I feel in a lot of fields like ours, you get that as an opportunity to say, what is normal, no? Because people are in some ways seeing and hearing voices around you, which you can't see and hear. So you kind of start in some way accepting and opening your heart and mind to say, this is their reality and that's okay. This is my reality and that's okay. And it doesn't make their reality wrong or my reality right. It lets you also move past some of that judgment and some of the very critical thinking that it's very easy to get into, saying my way is the right way and your way isn't, because in any given space, you just become very cognizant of the fact that there are so many realities here. And how do you best accommodate someone else?
Right. And with these experiences, you were then introduced to Buddhism. And how did that come about to be?
So, when I was working in the field of mental health, I began to realize that language was a little limiting. So, for instance, you or I say, I'm depressed. Okay. It means something when you say the words, I am depressed. But when somebody is listening to you and they hear, I am depressed, it means something completely else to them. For example, if you're speaking to a psychiatrist or someone from a mental health profession, depression becomes a diagnosis which comes with a certain cluster. You speak to a family member, they hear it with a certain amount of concern. And similarly, right? So I felt language can also have its own limitations, and perhaps we need to move beyond language. That's when I came across this course on arts based therapy, which was offered by a group in Pune called the WCCL Foundation. And arts based therapy really allowed for bringing in movement, games, visual, rhythm, so on and so forth. But the critical element that ABT gave me was its theoretical foundation is very well established in Indian mind tradition and largely a lot of Buddhist understanding of practice and how one should be. So, when we talk about, let's say, some kind of illness or disability which requires therapy, the question is the disability or illness causing unhappiness? Or is unhappiness caused also by the disability and illness? But there are also other elements in your own mind which are perhaps contributing to it. So, can ABT, arts based therapy, be a modality to not only address or help you cope with your illness or disability, but also can it broaden your understanding of what happiness is or what suffering is and how do you move past it? So, what completely got my attention, besides me getting what I wanted in terms of increasing vocabulary, because I was so stiff and rigid before that. So, I felt, they were able to bring lightness and fun into therapeutic spaces, which I feel was missing for me at least. But in addition to that, they gave me this flavor of what Buddhist mind tradition offered. And then I was very, very again fortunate to find Asha, who is the director of WCCL Foundation, who offered to train me in Buddhist psychology further. So we were able to kind of offer this course together initially. And then, of course, I started teaching it alone, but she continues to be my teacher and we continue to collaborate and work together.
Great. So, that brings us to the applied Buddhist psychology part. What's it about, and what are its key components?
So, often when I use the term Buddhist psychology, the first idea is it sounds kind of religious, but it really isn't. Psychology is really study of mind and behavior. When I use the term Buddhist psychology, what I mean is like you would, let's say, use the term humanistic psychology. Okay, which means it's following a certain school of thought. Or if I use the term existential or behavioral psychology, it's coming from a certain school or a group of individuals. Similarly, when I use the term Buddhist psychology, it's basically saying that there was the Buddha, which is a historical person, and he was clearly saying, I'm not God. He was saying, I'm a human being. But that there is a way in which one can examine the mind and recognize that there are certain internal factors which influence our own happiness and suffering. And if we take care of them, we can move towards finding peace and cessation on the inside. And he put this in this beautiful framework saying, there's a problem, which is suffering. This problem has a clear cause. Then stopping it is possible. And there's a path to stopping it. So I feel when we use the term Buddhist psychology, what we're saying is it's coming from this lineage of this one teacher and, of course, his students, followers, disciples, other bodhisattvas along the path who continued to formulate and articulate this view so that today, 2,500, 600 years ago, you and I can sit and say, hey, what is this? So I feel when I use the term Buddhist psychology, it's really in some way like giving credit where it's due. It's coming from this lineage and we kind of recognize that. The applied component for me, however, becomes very, very critical because it's one thing to go to a doctor and get medicine, but you get your prescription filled and you keep it by your bedside. You're not really getting better. Dawai liya hai, you need to kind of consume it, right, according to the schedule. So I feel the path is fabulous, but we need to apply it to our life. And sometimes when we read a text or we read a sutra or a shastra, it feels really profound, but you're like, when I'm fighting with my spouse or my teenage kid is slamming a door in my face, I don't know what to make of that sutra in that moment. So the application part is really saying, how do we bring that into our everyday life, right? You're stuck in a traffic jam. Your boss has thrown a deadline at you at Friday, 4 o'clock, or whatever other issues which you and I come across in our daily life. Saying, how does one bring these profound practices back into our everyday chai, coffee kind of spaces?
So when you say Buddhist psychology, are you really referring to the Four Noble Truths kind of a lineage, or is this let's say, a combination of modern psychology techniques and Buddhism as it was originally meant?
That's a very good question. So first of all, it's also a little tricky question. So I'm going to try and answer it in a manner which clarifies and doesn't leave more confusion. When we use the term Buddhism, it often feels like one homogeneous group. But that's really far, far, far from the truth. You've got multiple schools of thought. The Four Noble Truths is something which most schools of Buddhism agree and follow as well. In addition to that, of course, there are other sutras, other kinds of texts, practices which they bring in. Here, when we talk about it, we are following Buddhist thought and Buddhist text, but perhaps the language which we are using is going to be an everyday language. So, in that sense, the text gets translated into manner of speaking which is more palatable and understandable by regular everyday people like you and me. So in that sense, it's not following a certain fixed tradition. Although my teacher comes from a Tibetan Mahayana lineage. So those influences are, of course, very heavy in the work that we do. But we follow it really in a manner which is more secular, in a manner which is more everyday. We also combine elements of neuroscience, psychology, quantum physics, because that's also been my background. So that's also language which is something I'm comfortable with. And I see these areas as intersecting so closely that in my mind, I can't help but bring those aspects in.
Perfect. So you mentioned the application part, and obviously that has various threads. And I will ask you about applying it when we are all at peace and sitting on a meditation, right, yoga cushion and stuff, and then applying it on the traffic jam and somebody's honking a horn. But before we come to applying it, what is this it part? What do we have to apply?
Okay. So it's really large. So, of course, I'm clearly not going to do justice to what I need to say, but I'll try. So, one is any of our Indian philosophical thoughts, quite honestly, and Buddhism is one of them. The goal is always to see reality clearly. Okay. And the question of are we suffering? And I feel it's quite clear we are in so many ways. Sometimes it feels only that illness or death or loss feels like suffering. But honestly, if you and I look at our everyday, you can see there is a distractedness. You can see there is a restlessness. There is some kind of anxiety running through our day constantly. So I feel when we examine causes of suffering, what Buddhism is really saying is there is reality. There is the way we see reality. These are two separate things. And it is the way we see reality which causes our suffering. So if by default you want to decrease your suffering, you need to start seeing reality a little bit more accurate. The Buddhist psychology components, which really focus on the mind, talk about what is the mind, how the mind works, different classifications and categories of the mind, different mental states that we occupy, and how we can recognize them, how we understand that when they kick in, your interpretation, almost the entire room in which you are, has shifted. And how does one really start to stabilize the mind, observe these mind states, and slowly begin to work on them so that we are not clouded by these mind states all the time, so that we are better able to get a sense of who we really are, what reality really is, and not be taken in by what we've presumed to be real. Also, the invitation in Buddhism is never to accept on faith. The invitation is always come and see. So it's always a very gentle approach of saying, see if this makes sense. And the Buddha himself had said, don't accept my teachings on faith. By all means, treat it like a goldsmith would check gold. Put that much intensity in your checking. But once you've recognized that this is making sense, then it is critical to put the same amount of diligence on the path to practice. Then there's no point saying, okay, I see it, but now I don't move. The goal is to also move along with it, right?
Yeah, but so one thing, the last point which you mentioned, that once you see it, it makes sense to practice.
Yes.
But it's kind of a circle, no? Once you practice, only then you can see it.
I feel we start with, so there was this beautiful university in India many, many centuries ago called the Nalanda. And the Nalanda method was frankly something that we try to bring back, where we talk about first we study, because if you don't study something new, you're going to go on with the old way of thinking, believing it's the new way of thinking, but actually it's the old way in loop. So you study something new, and studying could be different things. It could be listening. I mean, something as simple as this, triggering off a thought and then saying, okay, I need to read further. It could be reading a book. It could be finding a group. So first is we study. After we study, the next thing we want to do is contemplate. Does it make sense? Does this hold true? And then when it slowly does, then we start saying, how do I apply it? So I feel it perhaps starts with study. And studying, fortunately, of course, all of us sitting with, in some ways, I feel grateful to COVID because all our Wi-Fi have improved. And, the amount of technology which we have, and of course, what we use it for. Instead, if we are able to use it in a manner which is helpful, which helps us access some of this wisdom, which is so profound. And there are very simple ways to bring it back into our everyday life. It doesn't have to be something completely complicated. So I've had, for example, young mothers telling me, listen, all of this is fine, but I don't have the time for it. Or, if you're in the middle of March 31st is coming and, your year is closing, whatever that means, that I've got too many commitments at this stage. I don't have time. There are simpler ways to start, but the goal is to start somewhere, and we start wherever we are, so that it doesn't have to be something very exotic. It doesn't have to be a large step. I had this very kind teacher who used to teach mindful walking, and she would say, at some point, she would teach us mindful standing, and then she'd look at all of us saying, you all look like people who wait for elevators. When you're waiting for your lift, can you do this? So it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be here and now. And that's, I think, the beauty of the path.
Yeah, I think in Deer Park, it's written over there where you wash your utensils, that you can wash while being mindful.
Yes, yes.
So all of that is there. Nivedita, did you also have some Vedanta background?
No, but I love reading, so
Yeah, because the process which you mentioned, the Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana, right, listening and contemplating and then applying. It's a very traditional Vedanta prescribed methodology. But on this aspect, you mentioned that Indian thought is almost all of these yoga, Sankhya, Vedanta, Buddhism, even, right? They all come to that initial point, which is reality is distinct from what you are making it out to be. There is something else which is reality, right? So that is usually the initial starting point. So that then becomes that, okay, first you recognize that maybe how I am living my life, maybe what I'm doing is not the actual real part of it. So I have to shift my perspective. And how does that process start? I mean, where do you shift your perspective if not to this world in which we are living?
So what you said is beautiful, because one is, how we are brought up, right? Constantly we are told, look outside. How's your colleague doing? How are you doing? It's all relative. And the emphasis is always on keeping the lens outward. So I feel one of the first few things is just to start with saying, can I build conviction in the fact that I am suffering in some way, however we want to use the word. Suffering sometimes feels like a very heavy word, and people say, ye to bahut negative hai. In which case, I'm like, what word would you like to substitute with? The goal is to get that there is some unrest. So if unrest works, we bring unrest. If dis-ease not like a disease. If just an unease works, we bring that in. Or I like the Indian term of dukkha, just saying that it's not sukha, it's just not sukha, which is fine. So the goal of saying that, one is we recognize there is a restlessness which feels almost integral to my being, and it feels like that, and all the time I'm looking for the next thing to solve it. My money, partner, job, promotion, car, EMI, whatever, right? I don't think here anybody looks for the EMI, but so and while we're doing this, we recognize that we've been trained to look outward. The second step is just starting to see how much of the world is actually coming from our own mind. For instance, if you're stuck in a traffic jam, right? Take a moment to just really look around you. You will see at least 10, 12 cars, vehicles, people around, all of whom are in some way stuck and affected by the same traffic jam. And just ask yourself, what am I feeling? So let's say you're really agitated in that moment. You had to get somewhere, and now the school bus has broken down in front of you, or whatever else, right? As you look at other people, can you recognize not everybody is the same level of agitated? Some people are calm, some are equally agitated, someone is singing a song, someone else is in a conversation. And really stopping to ask yourself, what is causing my anger? And our first level of answer is, it's the traffic. How can I not be angry, right? But if the traffic causes anger, shouldn't it be causing anger for everybody here? And then you realize, okay, everybody is not angry. So then what you've actually done is said, my emotional state is not coming only from what we call as an external factor, but there's something on the inside which is also influencing it, right? And 7th century scholar Shanti Deva had very beautifully written in his book saying, where are you going to find enough leather to cover the earth? Would it not be wiser to cover your own 2 feet instead? Saying that you can't control all the world. You can control your own space. So whenever there is any interaction between external factor and internal factor, it can lead to suffering, but the suffering is because the traffic has met with your state of mind. Have no control over this bus breaking down and causing traffic suddenly, but you do have control over your inner state of mind. So you start recognizing the subjectivity we bring to every situation. And when that conviction builds up, then you know it's time to turn the lens inward. And that's where you start your practice, and that's where you start saying, what have I brought here? What am my contribution here? What can I do to flip it? And even if we can't flip it around 100% to start with, even if we just, from the clap which happens, even if you don't just able to stop it right here, you still decrease your suffering significantly.
No, I agree. So wherein comes my next question. So 2 questions. One is that before I say, how can I flip it? There is this portion of taking responsibility that this is not the traffic's problem. This is not my boss's fault. This is not my neighbor's shouting, which has got me into this situation. And I'm assuming that part of taking responsibility is a huge friction for many. How do you deal with it, and how do you deal when you teach your students? Because I'm assuming that's a very common, it's a common resistance point. If you say somebody that you're not happy because of you, or because of how you are seeing the world. And then the immediate reaction is, well, I am doing everything I can, and it's this person's fault and that person's fault. So how do you deal with that counterpoint?
That's a beautiful question again, and something, like you very rightly said, comes up repeatedly, right? So this is not to say that the world is fabulous. Clearly we're in the middle of a war, even if it's not happening where you and I sit. People are dying as we speak. There have been genocides on this planet. We all know about global warming and where the planet is currently, and it's not usually considered a very good space to be for our future generations. So this is not to say that external issues are not there. There are external issues, and we all frankly have to work towards it. This is, my background is in social work because I feel we have to be agents of change. Now, we can be agents of change in whatever scope we want to, but what becomes the biggest tool of your change is you. So you can choose to address global warming or war or government or corruption or whatever it is, the issue that you're dealing with. in multiple ways. And question is, are you most skillful when you are angry? Are you most skillful when you are agitated? And the answer is very likely a no. There are very few people who are going to say, I'm actually at my best when I'm raging. So for most of us, we recognize, if let's say you are met with a very angry person, okay? Let's say this boss that you have is extremely demanding, extremely insensitive. Friday, 4 o'clock, you know the message saying, come to my desk means weekend ka kaam hai, or whatever other things there is, right? You can recognize that, is this something which is in some way an external situation? Of course, yes. But can you understand that you are responding in a certain way, either with agitation or being sulking about it or something else? Can you shift your own behavior or response to that? And most of us will realize it's very difficult to do it. And we start with that space of saying, it's really tough to do. I really just want to latch back, and that's good because we're being honest about where we are and we're being honest about where our habits are. But we also recognize that our current habits are not perhaps the most helpful. For instance, I may really want my boss to change this habit of Friday, 4 o'clock, dumping tasks at my desk. But I don't have the power to say anything. So instead, now I'm boiling on the inside. I can't say anything here, but I will take it out perhaps on the way back home, or I will take it off tomorrow with my family or somewhere else. Instead, can I look at recognizing that I need to handle this situation? And if I need to handle the situation, my rage is not really the best option. I'm not able to let go of my habit. So, can I look at flipping or changing my habit to start saying, how do I perhaps become calmer or more present to when my boss is bringing this at my desk? And it may take some time because the first time I may be too anxious to say anything different. But maybe the second time or the third time, I'm able to say something really small, like saying, you want me to do it by this weekend? Or can I do half of it now and half later? Or perhaps I managed to even smile back, or I managed to do something a little bit different. What am I actually doing is this force of the habit, the momentum with which my habit kicks in. I'm able to slowly start breaking that apart. And as I break that apart, I'm able to start responding differently. Because boss's behavior and my behavior has formed a pattern over the past few weeks or months or whatever else. But now I'm trying to shift not just my behavior and response, but through my behavior and response, also perhaps his behavior and response. Can I also start saying, I don't see the boss perhaps completely? Now, this idea of evil boss has been implanted in my head. As soon as I see the guy, even on Monday, I'm now seething with rage. Instead, can I start seeing other parts of him, which really softens my stance a little bit? Which means, when you imagine this guy as, I don't know, a father or a spouse or you see him smiling and laughing with someone else, and you say, okay, maybe he's not such a bad guy. My lens makes him seem completely evil. So we broaden that stance. Then maybe I say on Wednesday, I'll go and ask him if there is anything he wants me to do on Friday, saying I'm planning to step out. Or even if I don't want to say that, I say, I just wanted to check if there's anything you wanted to give me on Friday. And that's all I managed to start with saying. Maybe first week, no difference. Maybe second week, he starts giving it to me on Wednesday or Thursday instead of Friday, 4 o'clock. So what have I done is really saying, can I shift my habit a little bit? Because the goal is not to say we don't want to manage the outside. I mean, frankly, my hope, and even the Buddhist largest view, is we want to become a Buddha for the benefit of all sentient beings, right? So we want to look at benefit of everyone. So that means each of us has to become not only strong and powerful enough to control our own habits of anger, anxiety, whatever, but we're also able to actually reach out and help others because they are pretty much stuck with their own patterns, just like we are. That boss is equally stuck with his habit or pattern. It's very unlikely that savere utke somebody is waking up saying, I have to make your life miserable alone, right? Most people are too consumed with their own happiness to really say, my job is to make you miserable. So we start broadening our take and start bringing a lot of that back in.
And all of that makes perfect logical sense, right? So when you break it down in that manner, it really there is no counterpoint to that. This is a much better way of living. This is a much higher skillful way of living. But to me, at least, and again, I come from a more Vedantic background, but I've known Buddhism for some time. But a lot of this requires some level of emotional maturity before somebody gets started,
Of
right?
course.
And therein lies a little bit of trick, or not a trick, a trap, that some people are simply more attuned to be able to pivot to this point of thinking, and others may not be. Right? So how do you tackle that inherent resistance of some people, which is at a much higher level, between some people who are much higher receptive in this sort of thinking? How do those differences come up in your training, and how do you tackle them?
So let me clarify the question. How would you tackle them for yourself? How would you tackle them for someone else?
For your students is what.
Okay. So for students, I feel, one is, I think, again, I've been very lucky. Fabulous students. It's been 10 batches. And honestly, every batch has been just really spectacular. We've had all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds. My youngest has been 21. My eldest has been 79. You name the career, whether it's government jobs, whether it's corporate, high level, low level, teachers, homemakers, judges, artists. And it's been this fabulous mix of people who are saying something's missing. How do we fix it? And how do we kind of itch the itch that we started this conversation with? So, in that sense, I feel I've had a beautiful group to work with. Does this mean everybody receives, accepts, moves at the same pace? Answer is not at all. Even if you look at perhaps your own journey, or I look at mine, I don't know if we moved at the same pace, even during our own journey. There were phases where the growth felt wow. And there were phases you're like, kuch nahi ho raha hai. What the hell is this? So we've also had, I think, our ups and downs. And it's always difficult to tell when that phase is going to change or shift. All you can do is really keep showing up and practicing. But when it comes to students also, I hold that in my mind very clearly, that I don't know where each one is. Sometimes there's a lot of difficulty and struggle, which is very functional in their life, which means the ability to devote time and attention here is much less. And yet they are holding on, which is spectacular, right? So it's easy to sometimes look at someone and say, they're not paying as much attention. But if you actually look at all that's going on, and the fact that they're still managing to show up is actually quite the achievement. So a lot of it is about really retraining your own mind. There was this beautiful story about this lama who's head of a monastery. I don't know if it's a true story or not. But I love it. So in this monastery, there was a new monastic who was taken in, and he had a background of stealing. And while he lived in this monastery, he continued to steal from all the others, the seniors and his batchmates and so on. And it was beginning to bother everybody. So his batchmates complained to the seniors complained to the teachers, and there was this is too much. Each time they would catch him, it would be really difficult to kind of deal with it, until finally all the students get together and go to the main head lama and say, teacher, this is too much. We cannot have this fellow in our midst anymore. He needs to leave. He's clearly not worthy of this monastery. And the teacher turns around and says, why is that? And they give into this whole rant about everything that this person is not doing correct. And the teacher says, you're very right. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I cannot let this boy go, because clearly he needs to be here more than anyone else. But if all of you think you'll have figured it out, you're free to leave. So I feel so much of it has to do with how we see these situations. Yeah. And the more we clear our view, I feel it becomes a little easier to deal with all kinds of...
Yeah, and I think there's a fair degree of selection bias going on in these retreats and courses. People who register for these retreats are already somewhere in the ecosystem. But going back to something which Nivedita mentioned, was that in your social work, and as human beings, as privileged humans in this planet, we all are agents of change. So how do you balance between changing the situation itself and between changing ourselves? So let's look at it in your earlier scenario of a boss who's calling you again and again at 4 p.m. and you have, right, you can look at him from different lenses, you can try to figure out stuff, but at some point it makes sense to just switch jobs.
Sure.
Right. So how do you balance between changing ourselves and between changing the situation?
Okay. So again, if I take a pure Buddhist view, we talk about the goal of changing self, right? Is saying, I want to become a Buddha. That's the ultimate view that we're kind of working towards. But when we're saying, I want to become a Buddha, it's not that I want to become a Buddha because I can then be worshipped and be king. It's saying, I want to become a Buddha for the benefit of all sentient beings. So, in some ways, the change for self and the change for the other is not separate, it's the same. And second, the degree of change that is being aspired for, both for self and for other, is not different. It's not like I want to be Buddha and you can be Buddha minus one. It's saying we all want to achieve the same degree of change. So, from a Buddhist point of view, actually, there's no difference between what we're trying to do. But where you and I are, we need to kind of say, okay, this is where I'm at, and how do I change the world? And why am I changing the world also? Depending on our capacities. For most of us, we can only talk about changing our own little corner, right? We can't talk about changing larger spaces. There are people, for example, who, like just now, you're holding a podcast. If you're hosting a podcast, for instance, your capacity to reach out goes far beyond the offices and spaces that you regularly engage in. It's much greater in these spaces. And I feel in that sense, all of us have this capacity to reach out to more and more spaces. But in the smaller spaces that it comes to, it's about saying, I'm transforming my mind because my mind is captured by a habit, right? My mind is hijacked by my habit. While I would like to think I have free will, most of the time my free will is basically my habit taking over. But my boss is actually no different. My boss is also thinking he's got free will, but actually his habit, whether his habit is poor time management, whether his habit is just to pass things off which have not been done at the end of the week, or whatever other habits my boss may have. My boss is also caught with his own habit. So, can I look at first calming my habit down enough so I'm not raging or I'm not agitated or I'm not upset? That's one level of work. The second level of work is to say, can I understand he's perhaps not really very happy either? He's probably suffering because he's also caught up in his own habit. And if he's caught up in his own habit, just as my habit causes me suffering, most of our habits, when they've got us in the grip, they have us in some ways not feeling okay because we're imprisoned in some way. And we want to be able to say, how does one use that to generate compassion towards the other person and to say, maybe I can shift that as well. Maybe I help them as well. And initially, it can be really small. All you may manage to do the first few times is just say, I'll smile and accept the same file. That's all I managed to do. And that's okay too, because what you've done is you've not only switched the momentum of your habit, which pushes you towards anger, but really brought it to a neutral space. And now trying to see what else you can do with it. So I think being able to hike up the number of tools we have, hike up our capacity to manage our own anger, hike up our ability to see the larger level situation in that moment can be extremely beneficial.
Yeah, no, that was really, really lovely. I mean, I especially like the first part which you mentioned is that even embedded in this question of changing ourselves and changing situation, this or part is signifying some bit of grasp of an ego or some bit of a limited mindset. And something which you mentioned is that strictly from a Buddhist point of view, the goal is not only that I become enlightened and everybody else can do as they please. It's a much more broader scope, and all the theories, practices have to be like looked upon from that perspective. It cannot be limited in scope. So we look at theory as vast and practice as a very limited scope. No, I absolutely agree with that part. Uh, Nivedita, moving on. I mean, again, just so I would have loved you. You mentioned free will, but maybe that's for another episode. Uh, Before we go that, I mean, so when you take Buddhist psychology or applied Buddhist psychology as a very uh, neuroscience mindful or neuroscience or scientific evidence backed kind of a roadmap. So do you stay clear from the other concepts of nirvana or jhanas, or do they also still figure in your teaching?
So not within this for sure, but do I explore it? And answer is yes, I explore it because I have a mind which is curious and which wants to know more. For example, you speak of the Advaita, and the Nirvana Shatakam in some ways also says, I am not the intellect, I am not the father, I am not the mother, I'm not the child, I'm not the guru. This notion of being able to access and move towards the truth, it is something that I do read and engage in because I feel we come from such a rich tradition. We cannot afford to lose it. And sometimes I worry that the flavor of fervor and fanaticism, which sometimes kicks in, can be actually tempered by real study of knowing what schools of thought were really like, of understanding how debates went on between schools of thought, how much tolerance there was, and therefore how much growth and clarity. Because when do you articulate your views is actually in dialogue. So I feel if it was not for those spaces, we would not be able to reap this benefit today. And we need to, in some ways, pass it on to many others. The other part I feel is all of us have very different kinds of uh, habits and ways of operating. And we therefore also have different needs from what we need from a philosophical school. And I feel there is great benefit in this richness and diversity between religions, between philosophical schools, because it matches certain people's needs. And the goal is not to say that this path is the only path or this path must work for everyone or so on. Within the course, of course, we stick with Buddhist psychology because that's what the course offers. But we do introduce some of the others because the goal is to set the student on a path of learning and application, so that it becomes most meaningful, so that we all understand happiness is pretty much in our control. The blanket will warm you, a golden blanket will warm you, but a rug will warm you just as well, a rag will warm you just as well, right? Question is, where is contentment going to come from? And it can't be focused on the outside alone. So even if we are able to make that switch of saying, I reflect inward a little bit more. I understand myself a little bit more. I'm able to let go of some of my hang-ups a little bit more. I'm able to be a little bit more easy in my space and people, not because it only makes others' lives easy, but because it also makes my life easy. If I'm comfortable with the AC being only between, I don't know, 19 and 20 degrees. Now, actually, I'm setting myself up for a lot of being miserable because if I live in Bombay or Dubai or Gurgaon, it's very rarely going to sit between 19 and 20. In which case, my potential for feeling miserable is going to be really, really high. But if I learn to make myself comfortable between, I don't know, 18 and 25 degrees, the likelihood of finding more peace and happiness for me is so much more. So, we use the idea of self to start with because that's where we are. And then we slowly learn to broaden our perspective to include everybody else because all paths frankly help us become better, I think, as humans. No, we crossed 8 billion recently on this planet. We can't afford to not be thinking about others anymore. Don't think we could for a long time, but at least now for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and in terms of, I mean, we have a lot of it you've already said in terms of applying at which moments, but in terms of practices, are there any initial few first steps which anybody listening could take and just be a little bit more happier in their life and a little bit better?
Okay, so I think the simplest thing to do is okay, I'll give you three. So one is just being present. I think life is in the here and now. It's not in the past or in the future. So if you're waiting for a lift or you're stuck in traffic or, your partner's not presented you with a meal yet, little gaps and moments, can you just take a deep breath and come back into this present moment and say, here I am? And just being mentally and physically in the same place. Breath is a great anchor for it. But in addition to breath, it could be a sensation, it could be thoughts, it could be really recognizing also how much we receive. Because sometimes our minds tend to be a little skewed towards what we don't receive. But if you simply recognize that here I am breathing, here I am If you ask me where is Nivi, this becomes Nivi. But right now I'm taking in oxygen from this surrounding room. So something which was actually not a part of me has become a part of me. It's integrated with my body. And similarly, some carbon dioxide which was inside me has actually gone out. This miracle is happening every moment. We don't see it. So being present, I think, gets you to really hit pause and look at things that you perhaps didn't look at. Even if it's a partner who's giving you burnt food, you really stop and you look at, oh, somebody cares enough to really do something for me. It allows you to hit pause to just see things a lot more. So I think being present, it could be while waiting for an elevator, it could be while you're flooring the pedal on a clear road. Can you just keep coming back to breath and being present? That would be one. The second thing is be kind. We like to think that we are kind, but we all could be kinder, and can we keep hiking it up? No matter what we do, it's about being able to say, I can take somebody else's perspective in, or just say, what are they going through in this moment? And if the answer is, I don't know, which is what it is most of the time, can I be as kind as I can be? Knowing fully well that I can't be perhaps as kind as our great teachers we've had, but maybe I can be as kind or as skillful in this moment. Even when I want to say no, even when I want to set a boundary, I don't have to slam a door or burn a bridge and say, I don't care. I can just be saying, I really don't have the time right now. I appreciate it very much. Thank you. And stepping back, it could be as small as that. The third thing with self, I would say, is to be wisely kind. And this is the words I'm using from my teacher. He says, kindness is not, because when I started telling people to be kind and they would get back to me saying, weekend is over, I just binged on Netflix with, it was like 3 seasons are done. And I'm like, that's not what I meant. So kindness, I think by itself doesn't work. We need to be a little wisely kind about saying, what are we doing? And instead of zoning out and allowing ourselves to be distracted, can we find ways of doing what really helps us? So, to first of all, I think knowing what really helps, because zoning out, for instance, has not actually helped you. Monday, the same set of problems that you tried not to think about on Friday are going to present themselves to you, perhaps with some mold and fungus over the 3 days. So, it's not better. So, really stopping to say there needs to be some honesty, kind honesty though, and some amount of saying, I don't want to do it today, and that's okay. We can be honest about it, but saying, I can try tomorrow. So you've not shut it off with anger, you've shut it off with full openness and honestness. And I feel that's okay too. We need to draw those boundaries every now and then. But can it be done with kindness to self? So, but being wisely kind towards self. So 1 is being present, 2 is being kind with others, and 3 is being wisely kind with self.
Perfect. And both of the second and third parts are actually built upon being present. Otherwise, you're just in the hamster wheel and there is no chance of.
Absolutely.
Before we end, Nivedita,
yes.
any story, anecdote, quotation which has been close to your heart?
So many. So many. Well, okay, I'll pick one because it kind of
you
goes.
You can pick as many as you like.
No. Then we'll be here all night. But so and I really enjoy Buddhism also because of the amount of story and metaphor. That, and I feel it's so rich if you get to stay with it long enough. It just shows you different aspects. But given that what we were sharing and speaking about, there's this beautiful metaphor which is in one of the sutras as well as many of the teachers talk about it in the teaching, saying if you were to take a handful of salt and put it in a bowl of water, you cannot drink this water anymore. It's way too salty. And suffering in some way is like that. Somebody says something and you've put it in this heart of yours and you can't take it, and now you're seething with rage and anger. But similarly, if you take this handful of salt and you put it in a large pond or a large river, like let's say the Ganga, what happens? Frankly, nothing. The water stays absolutely fine. Not because the salt was not potent or powerful, but because you've increased the capacity of the water to hold it, right? So can we also look at our heart in the same sense? The smaller our heart, every little piece of salt coming our way makes it undrinkable. But if we're able to open our heart connect with spaciousness that we really are, getting in touch with our true nature, beginning to see reality as this extremely fluid space which has so many causes and conditions, and seeing self as extremely fluid and evolving all the time. Then we open our heart more and more. Then every harsh word that gets said, every seemingly unjust or unfair thing doesn't have us suffering as much. Our capacity becomes so much more. And then perhaps our capacity to influence and work with people around us also becomes so much more.
It does. That was wonderful. Another one?
No, I will go on. Okay, I'll give you one more. So there's this beautiful story again. This lama who's in a monastery. And, this monastery becomes really famous because they've got a crystal vase which was handed over many generations earlier from a king who was inspired by the teaching. Okay, so this monastery is now really famous, not just for the teachings, but for the crystal vase. And you have hundreds of people coming in to say, oh my God, and look at the light, and it's all fabulous. And now it so happens that this, again, young monk who's cleaning around happens to dust with a little bit more enthusiasm, and the crystal vase collapses to the floor. It breaks and shatters into a million pieces, and now everybody around is aghast, saying, oh, no, this is not okay. How are we going to tell the head of the monastery? How will we tell the lama? And they're all now trying to figure out the best way, trying to calm themselves because this is a big shame. Anyway, finally, they approach the lama's door, and the teacher is there. He's reading his text. They open the door and they push this little boy in, the one who broke the vase, because obviously they need to have somebody's head which has to go. And then they walk in behind and they say, teacher. And the teacher looks up and says, yes. He says, the vase is broken. And then the teacher says, okay, and continues to read the text. And now they're all standing really confused, saying, what's going on? Did he not get it? And they wait for a few moments respectfully. Then they can't contain their own anxiety and they're like, teacher. And teacher says, yes. The vase is broken. The vase, like in case you didn't get it, let me really. And the teacher says, the vase was already broken. Basically saying that we hold on to things as if they're going to be permanent, as if they're going to stay with us forever. Nothing is, no? So everything is in a process of change. And if you're able to see it in that light, hold things lightly without getting all attached and grasping at stuff, saying it should never change, it's a little easier.
It's already changing.
Yes, really.
Yeah, Nivedita, this has been wonderful. And you're a great storyteller, by the way. So, maybe,
so sweet. Thank you. I'll thank my teachers for that as well. I used to be much, much more boring before the arts-based therapy.
So glad we didn't have that podcast 2 years back.
7, but yes.
7 years back. But this has been really wonderful. And I would love to have you again sometime. There's much depth to discuss.
Absolutely.
But I think as an introduction to applied Buddhist thought and also the way you teach and where you're coming from, I think there were lots of practical tidbits in between which should help many. So again, thanks so much for taking the time. It's been lovely talking to you.
Very grateful to be here, Deepak. I really appreciate not just your diligence, but I feel also your attention to detail and how much that I think helps both, I'm sure, for me as well as for the listeners. Also, everybody in your team who's behind the scenes, because I feel that support becomes critical. And of course, I just want to express my gratitude to all my teachers because honestly, this notion of all that we receive has to be so, I think, pronounced in our minds so that we recognize that it's been just such a blessing to get so much. And at the very least we can do is start passing it on. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Take care.